When the desert swallowed Arizona, the 1958 dust storm that wiped entire towns off the map, that single sentence would define an entire generation of families who called the Arizona desert home. In the spring of 1958, the land they trusted turned against them in ways no one could have predicted. The sky darkened, the air thickened, and within hours entire communities vanished beneath walls of brown and red earth that moved faster than any car on the highway. This is not a story of a single day. This is a story of what happens when nature reminds humanity of its own fragility, when progress meets the unstoppable force of the elements, when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and must choose between fleeing everything they know or standing their ground against the impossible. The towns of Maricopa County had seen dust before. Every resident knew the feeling of grit between their teeth after a windy afternoon. They knew how to cover their faces with wet cloths and wait for the air to settle. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what was coming. Nothing in the history books warned them of a storm that would reshape the landscape itself. Chapter 1. The Last Ordinary Morning. April 14, 1958, began like any other Monday in the small town of Gila Bend, Arizona. The sun rose at 5:47 in the morning, painting the desert horizon in shades of orange and pink that tourists would have paid money to photograph. But there were no tourists that morning. Only farmers checking irrigation lines, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, and children reluctantly preparing for another week of school. Margaret Ellen Saunders was 43 years old and had lived in Gila Bend her entire life. She stood on the porch of her modest ranch house, watching her husband Theodore drive their pickup truck toward the eastern fields. The cotton crop looked promising that year. After 3 seasons of disappointing yields, they finally had reason to hope. Margaret waved until the truck disappeared behind a low ridge, then turned back inside to prepare breakfast for their 2 teenage sons. 3 miles away at the Gila Bend Elementary School, Principal Harold Whitmore was reviewing the week's lesson plans. He had served as principal for 11 years and knew every child in town by name. That morning he noticed the American flag outside his office window, hanging completely still. Not a breath of wind disturbed its fabric. In Arizona, stillness often preceded something significant. Harold made a mental note to check the weather forecast when he had a moment. The town diner, known simply as Rosa's Place, was already filling with its regular morning crowd. Rosa Delgado had opened the restaurant in 1949, with money saved from working in the cotton fields. Now she employed 6 people and served the best huevos rancheros within 100 miles. The smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon drifted through the screen door as farmers and workers settled into their usual booths. At the counter sat William Patterson, a meteorologist from the Phoenix Weather Bureau, who happened to be passing through on his way to a conference in Tucson. He was studying a map spread out beside his coffee cup, tracing the patterns of a low-pressure system moving in from the west. Something about the readings troubled him, though he could not articulate exactly what. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than the models predicted. The humidity levels were unusually low, even for the desert, and the wind patterns suggested convergence over the open plains southeast of Phoenix. William folded his map and asked Rosa if there was a telephone he could use. She pointed to the back of the restaurant, near the restrooms. He excused himself and dialed the Phoenix office, but the line was busy. He tried twice more before giving up and returning to his breakfast. Whatever was bothering him could wait until he reached Tucson. By 8 o'clock, the town was fully awake. Children walked to school in small groups, kicking rocks along the dusty sidewalks. Mothers hung laundry on backyard lines, trusting the desert sun to dry everything within hours. Merchants arranged displays in their shop windows. The gas station attendant checked oil levels and filled tanks for travelers heading west toward California. No one noticed the faint brown line appearing on the northeastern horizon. It was too far away, too subtle against the pale morning sky. Even if someone had spotted it, they might have dismissed it as distant mountains or a trick of the light. The desert played such tricks all the time. Theodore Saunders was the first to sense something wrong. He had stopped his truck near the irrigation canal to check a valve that had been sticking. As he knelt in the red earth, he felt a vibration beneath his knees. Not an earthquake, nothing that dramatic, more like a deep hum traveling through the ground itself. He placed his palm flat against the soil and felt it again, steady, rhythmic, growing stronger. He stood and looked toward the horizon. The brown line was thicker now, stretching from north to south as far as he could see. It seemed to be moving, though at this distance he could not be certain. Theodore had witnessed dust storms before. Every farmer in Arizona had, but there was something different about this one, something about its size and speed that made his stomach tighten. He climbed back into his truck and started the engine. The cotton could wait. He needed to get back to Margaret and the boys. At the elementary school, the first-grade teacher, Nancy Birch, was leading her students through a reading exercise when the classroom lights flickered. She paused and looked toward the window. The sky outside had taken on a yellowish tint, as if someone had placed a sepia filter over the world. Nancy had grown up in Oklahoma and recognized that color immediately. It was the color of her childhood nightmares, the color that had driven her family west in search of a better life. She stood abruptly, startling her students. Without explanation, she walked to the window and pressed her face against the glass. The brown wall was visible now, perhaps 10 miles away and closing fast. It rose from the desert floor to heights she could not estimate, blocking out the sun and swallowing the landscape as it advanced. Nancy turned to her students, keeping her voice calm despite the fear rising in her chest. She told them they were going to play a special game. They would all move to the hallway and sit against the wall with their heads down, like they practiced during tornado drills. The children, sensing their teacher's urgency, obeyed without question. In the hallway, Nancy found other teachers doing the same thing. Principal Whitmore was moving from classroom to classroom, ensuring all students were accounted for. His face was pale but composed. He had telephoned the Weather Bureau in Phoenix and received a dire warning. A massive dust storm was bearing down on Maricopa County with unprecedented speed and density. All residents were advised to seek shelter immediately and remain indoors until further notice. By 9:15 in the morning, the brown wall was less than 3 miles from town. The sound preceded it, a deep roar like a freight train combined with the howling of 1,000 wolves. Windows began to rattle in their frames. Loose papers flew from porches and disappeared into the approaching darkness. Dogs howled and pulled at their chains, desperate to escape something they sensed but could not see. Margaret Saunders stood on her porch, watching the wall approach. Her sons, Thomas and Robert, stood beside her, their young faces frozen in a mixture of fear and awe. They had never seen anything like this. The storm seemed alive, a living creature of earth and wind, consuming everything in its path. Theodore's truck appeared on the road, moving faster than Margaret had ever seen him drive. He skidded to a stop in front of the house and jumped out, shouting for everyone to get inside. There was no time to gather belongings, no time to secure the livestock. There was only time to run. The family made it through the front door just as the first wave of dust hit. The world outside vanished. The sun disappeared. Day became night in an instant, a darkness more complete than anything Margaret had experienced. The roar was deafening, a physical force that pressed against the walls and shook the foundation of their home. They huddled in the center hallway, away from windows and exterior walls, covering their faces with wet towels Theodore had grabbed from the kitchen. Even inside, the air was thick with dust. It seeped through every crack, every gap in the weathered wood and plaster. They could feel it coating their skin, filling their nostrils, grinding between their teeth. Thomas, the older son at 17, reached for his mother's hand. In the darkness, he could not see her face, but he felt her fingers intertwine with his, squeezing tightly. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They simply waited, listening to the storm rage around them, hoping their home would survive. At Rosa's place, the morning crowd had transformed into a group of stranded refugees. Rosa had locked the doors and pulled the heavy curtains across the windows, but dust still filtered through the old building's many gaps. She moved among her customers, offering wet napkins and refilling water glasses, maintaining an atmosphere of calm that belied the chaos outside. William Patterson, the meteorologist, sat at the counter with his head in his hands. He should have known. The signs were there in the data, in the unusual readings that had troubled him at breakfast, but he had dismissed his instincts, choosing comfort over caution. Now, somewhere out there, people were caught in the open, facing a storm that no one had adequately predicted. The telephone rang, startling everyone in the restaurant. Rosa answered it hesitantly. The voice on the other end was barely audible over the static and the roaring wind. It was Sheriff Daniel Reyes, calling from his office on the other side of town. He needed to know if anyone at the diner had medical training. There were reports of injuries coming in, people caught outside when the storm hit, travelers on the highway, farm workers in the fields. Rosa looked around the room and spotted Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a retired physician who had moved to Gila Bend 5 years earlier, seeking peace and quiet. Elizabeth met Rosa's eyes and nodded. She had taken an oath once, and circumstances did not change that. She stood, gathered her things, and moved toward the door. The sheriff warned them to wait. Moving outside now was too dangerous. Visibility was zero. The wind could knock a person down, drag them across the ground, bury them under drifts of accumulating dust. They needed to wait until the storm passed, or at least weakened enough to allow movement. Elizabeth sat back down. Waiting had never been her strong suit, but she understood that she could not help anyone if she became a victim herself. She asked Rosa for coffee and settled in to ride out the storm, mentally preparing for what would come after. The first wave lasted nearly 2 hours. When it finally began to subside around 11:30 in the morning, the residents of Gila Bend emerged from their shelters into a transformed world. The familiar landscape had vanished. Streets were buried under 3 feet of dust and sand. Cars were half submerged, their windows opaque with grime. Trees had been stripped bare, their branches pointing east like accusing fingers. The sky remained brown and hazy, promising more to come. This was merely a pause, a brief respite before the next assault, but it was enough. People began moving, searching for neighbors, checking on the elderly and vulnerable, assessing the damage to their homes and businesses. Theodore Saunders opened his front door and stepped onto what had been his porch. The railing was gone, torn away by the wind. His truck, parked just 20 feet away, was barely visible beneath a mountain of accumulated dust. The cotton fields to the east had disappeared entirely, buried under a new desert that had not existed 3 hours earlier. He felt Margaret's hand on his shoulder. She stood beside him, surveying the destruction, her face streaked with tears that cut clean paths through the dust coating her skin. Their home had survived, but their livelihood had not. The crop they had nurtured for months, the hope they had carried through 3 difficult years, was gone. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every story we tell connects us to the past and prepares us for the future. By subscribing, you become part of a community that remembers, that learns, and that never forgets the lessons written in dust and determination. Chapter 2. The Wall That Ate the Sun. The pause between waves lasted less than 40 minutes. At 12:14 in the afternoon, the second wall appeared on the horizon, larger and more menacing than the first. This time there was no surprise. Every resident of Gila Bend knew what was coming. They had seen the beast's face and understood its hunger. Sheriff Daniel Reyes had used the brief respite to organize a response team. He deputized 6 volunteers, men and women who knew the area and had vehicles capable of navigating the debris-filled streets. Their first priority was the highway, where multiple accidents had been reported during the initial storm. Travelers from out of state, unfamiliar with desert conditions, had been caught completely unprepared. Dr. Elizabeth Warren rode in the sheriff's patrol car, her medical bag at her feet. The bag contained only basic supplies, hastily gathered from the diner and a nearby pharmacy whose owner had opened his doors despite the chaos. It would have to be enough. They found the first vehicle a mile outside of town, a station wagon from California, its license plate barely visible beneath the accumulated dust. The car had veered off the road and struck a concrete drainage culvert. The front end was crumpled like paper. Inside, a family of 4 sat motionless, their faces pale and frightened but miraculously unharmed. The father, a salesman named Gerald Foster, had been driving his wife and 2 daughters to a vacation in New Mexico. He had seen the storm approaching and tried to outrun it, pushing his speed well beyond safe limits. When visibility dropped to 0, he lost control. The culvert had stopped them. It had also saved them from driving deeper into the desert, where they might never have been found. Elizabeth checked each family member for injuries, while the sheriff helped them transfer to the patrol car. The mother, Helen, had a cut on her forehead that would need stitches, but nothing life-threatening. The daughters, ages 8 and 12, were shaken but physically fine. Gerald could not stop apologizing, as if the storm had been his fault, as if better driving could have prevented the inevitable. They found 3 more vehicles before the second wave forced them to seek shelter in an abandoned barn half a mile from the highway. The structure was old and weathered, its wooden walls showing gaps where boards had warped or fallen away, but it offered some protection from the wind, and the dust that filtered through was manageable compared to what raged outside. In the dim light, Elizabeth treated her patients. A truck driver with a broken arm sustained when his rig jackknifed, an elderly couple from Phoenix who had pulled over at the storm's first approach and now suffered from respiratory distress, their lungs irritated by the fine particles they had inhaled. A young man traveling alone who had tried to walk to safety and barely survived, his skin abraded by wind-driven sand, his eyes swollen nearly shut. The sheriff moved among the group, offering water and reassurance. He had lived in Arizona his entire life and had seen many storms, but nothing like this. The old-timers spoke of dust storms in the 1930s, tales handed down from parents and grandparents who had fled the Dust Bowl. Daniel had always considered those stories exaggerated, the way memories tend to magnify past hardships. Now he understood that they had been understated. The second wave lasted longer than the first. By the time it subsided, late afternoon had arrived, though the sky remained too dark to judge the time accurately. Elizabeth's supplies were nearly exhausted. 2 of her patients needed hospital care that she could not provide in a barn. The elderly woman's breathing had become labored, her lips taking on a bluish tint that signaled inadequate oxygen. Daniel radioed for help, but communications were spotty at best. The telephone lines were down. The radio tower on the edge of town had collapsed during the initial storm. They were isolated, cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on their own resources and ingenuity. Back in Gila Bend, the situation was equally desperate. Principal Harold Whitmore had kept 93 children safe in the school hallways through both waves, but conditions were deteriorating. The building's ventilation system had failed, and despite their best efforts to seal doors and windows, dust continued to infiltrate the corridors. Several children were coughing persistently. A few had developed nosebleeds from the dry, irritated air. Nancy Birch, the first-grade teacher, had taken charge of the youngest children. She sang songs with them, told stories, led them through finger games remembered from her own childhood in Oklahoma. She refused to let fear take hold. Children followed the emotional lead of adults, and Nancy was determined to project calm even as her own heart raced. The water fountain had stopped working after the first wave, likely due to dust clogging the pipes. Harold rationed the drinking water from the cafeteria, knowing it might need to last for hours more. He sent teachers to raid the custodian's closet for clean rags, which they wetted and distributed to cover mouths and noses. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the third wave hit without warning. Unlike the first 2, which had approached visibly from the horizon, this one seemed to materialize from everywhere at once. The air simply thickened, the light simply died, and the roar resumed with renewed fury. This wave brought something new: lightning. Massive bolts of electricity arced through the dust clouds, illuminating the darkness in brief, terrifying flashes. The static electricity, generated by billions of particles rubbing against each other, discharged in spectacular displays that resembled nothing the residents had ever witnessed. Thunder rolled continuously, blending with the wind's howl into a symphony of destruction. At the Saunders Ranch, the family had moved to the storm cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Margaret had insisted after the second wave passed, overruling Theodore's protests that the house had survived and would continue to do so. The cellar was cramped and uncomfortable, designed for storing preserves rather than sheltering people, but it offered protection that the house could not guarantee. They sat in darkness, having exhausted their supply of candles. The sounds from above were muffled but still audible, creaking and groaning that suggested the house was struggling against forces it had not been built to withstand. Thomas and Robert sat pressed against their mother, no longer pretending to be brave. Margaret held them both, whispering reassurances she was not certain she believed. Theodore sat apart, his back against the earthen wall, listening. He was calculating losses in his head, a farmer's instinct that refused to stop even in crisis. The cotton was gone, the irrigation equipment was probably destroyed. The truck was buried. The livestock, he did not want to think about the livestock. He had released the horses and cattle before the first wave hit, hoping they would find shelter on their own. It was all he could do. The third wave lasted until nearly 7 in the evening. When it finally passed, twilight was falling over a landscape that no longer resembled the Arizona anyone remembered. Dunes had formed where streets used to be. Houses were half buried, their rooftops the only visible markers of where families lived. The silence that followed the storm was almost as oppressive as the noise had been, a stillness so complete that survivors would later describe it as deafening. The first stars appeared through the lingering haze, distant and indifferent. Margaret Saunders climbed the ladder from the storm cellar and pushed open the hatch. The kitchen was gone, not damaged, not buried, but simply absent. But the walls had been torn away, the fixtures scattered, the floor covered in a foot of fine sand. Only the cellar hatch remained, a trapdoor to nowhere. She stood on the remains of her kitchen floor and looked at the night sky, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. Behind her, Theodore emerged from the cellar, followed by their sons. They gathered in the ruins of their home and held each other, 4 silhouettes against the stars, alive when so many might not be. Chapter 3. The Long Night. The hours after sunset brought new challenges. Temperatures in the Arizona desert drop rapidly after dark, and April nights can still carry a chill that surprises those unfamiliar with the region. Survivors who had sweated through the day's terror now shivered in lightweight clothing never intended for cold weather. Sheriff Reyes and his team finally made it back to town around 8:30 in the evening. The drive that normally took 15 minutes had required nearly 2 hours of navigating around debris, digging through drifts and twice stopping to help stranded travelers. Dr. Warren's patients were transferred to the town's small medical clinic, a building that had miraculously survived with minimal damage. The clinic was overwhelmed within an hour. Residents streamed in with injuries ranging from minor cuts to serious respiratory distress. Elizabeth worked alongside the clinic's regular nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had not slept in over 16 hours but refused to rest while patients needed care. They prioritized as best they could, treating the most urgent cases first while reassuring those who would have to wait. Among the waiting was a family from the edge of town, the Rodriguezes, who had brought their infant daughter after she stopped breathing during the 3rd wave. The baby had revived by the time they reached the clinic, but the parents were terrified it might happen again. Elizabeth examined the child carefully, listening to her lungs, checking her color and responsiveness. The baby seemed stable, but she recommended they stay at the clinic for observation. The parents agreed immediately, grateful for any professional guidance. Outside the clinic, volunteers organized search parties. Anyone with a working flashlight or lantern joined the effort. They moved through the buried streets in small groups, calling out names, listening for responses, marking houses that had been checked with chalk symbols on whatever surface remained visible. The search revealed both miracles and tragedies. An elderly man named Samuel Ortega was found alive in his bathtub, where he had instinctively sought shelter when the storm hit. He had pulled a mattress over himself and waited out all 3 waves, emerging dusty but unharmed. His wife, who had been in the kitchen when the storm arrived, had not survived. Samuel refused to leave her side when rescuers found them, sitting on the floor holding her hand and speaking softly in Spanish, words of love and farewell that rescuers would remember for the rest of their lives. The Gila Bend Elementary School became a temporary shelter for those whose homes had been destroyed. Principal Whitmore organized the gymnasium as a sleeping area, with mats from the physical education closet serving as beds. The cafeteria staff, those who could be reached, came to prepare whatever food was available. It was not much, sandwiches and canned soup and juice boxes, but no one complained. Having survived the storm, every small comfort felt like a luxury. Nancy Birch finally released her students to their parents around 10 in the evening. Most families had found each other by then, reunited through the search parties, or simply by showing up at the school. A few children remained, their parents still unaccounted for. Nancy stayed with them, reading stories by flashlight, pretending this was simply an exciting adventure rather than a potential tragedy. One of the unclaimed children was Miguel Santos, age 7. His mother worked at a laundry on the west side of town, and his father was a long-haul trucker who might be anywhere between Arizona and Texas. Miguel sat quietly in Nancy's classroom, not crying, not asking questions, simply waiting with a patience that seemed too mature for his years. Nancy asked him if he was scared. Miguel thought about the question before answering. He said his mother had always told him that storms pass, that the sky always clears, that morning always comes. He believed her. He was just waiting for morning. His mother arrived at 11:47 in the evening, covered in dust and weeping with relief. The laundry had collapsed during the 3rd wave, trapping her and 2 co-workers beneath fallen timbers. They had spent hours digging themselves out, then hours more walking through the transformed landscape to reach the school. Miguel ran to her and held on as if he would never let go. In the sheriff's office, Daniel Reyes was trying to establish contact with the outside world. The portable radio had limited range, but he managed to reach a state patrol unit near Casa Grande. The news from outside was both reassuring and alarming. Help was coming. The National Guard had been mobilized. Emergency supplies were being gathered in Phoenix. But the roads were impassable in many places, and it would be morning before any significant assistance could arrive. The state patrol officer asked about casualties. Daniel hesitated before answering. He did not yet know the full extent of the loss. Bodies were still being discovered. Some areas of town had not been searched. The final count would not be known for days. What he did know was this: Over 200 homes had been severely damaged or destroyed. The town's water tower had collapsed, leaving the community dependent on emergency supplies. The power grid was down and would remain so until crews could assess and repair the extensive damage. At least 15 people were confirmed deceased, with that number expected to rise. The officer on the radio expressed condolences and promised to relay the information to state officials. Daniel signed off and sat alone in his darkened office, the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He had sworn to protect this town. He had failed. Nature had proven itself more powerful than any human effort. At midnight, the Saunders family were still camped in the ruins of their kitchen, having no better option. Theodore had managed to salvage some blankets from a bedroom closet that remained partially intact. They huddled together for warmth, watching the stars through gaps in the lingering dust. Thomas, the older son, asked his father if they would rebuild. Theodore did not answer immediately. The question touched something deep and complicated, a mixture of love for the land and weariness of struggling against it. Finally, he said they would decide tomorrow. Tonight they would simply be grateful to be alive. They would count their blessings rather than their losses. Tomorrow was for decisions. Tonight was for survival. Margaret began to sing softly, a hymn her grandmother had taught her decades ago. The words spoke of trials and tribulations, of darkness and light, of faith sustaining through the worst of times. Her voice was thin and rough from breathing dust all day, but to her family, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. From across the ruined landscape, other voices joined hers. Neighbors in their own damaged homes, survivors in the streets, searchers pausing in their work. The hymn spread through the darkness like ripples on still water, connecting strangers and families alike in a moment of shared humanity. If this story is touching your heart, pause for a moment and leave a comment saying, "Even in the darkest storms, we find each other." Let this message be a reminder that we are all connected, in tragedy and in hope. Your comment is not just words, it is a way of keeping this memory alive. Chapter 4. The Dawn of Reckoning. The sun rose on April 15, 1958, illuminating a landscape that seemed to belong to another planet. Where green desert scrub had grown, only sand remained. Where roads had stretched toward the horizon, only dunes rolled endlessly. The familiar landmarks of Gila Bend were gone, buried or destroyed, leaving survivors to navigate by memory rather than sight. The Saunders family walked toward town at first light, having spent the night in the skeleton of their home. The journey that normally took 20 minutes required over an hour. They climbed dunes, skirted debris, and frequently stopped to help others they encountered along the way. By the time they reached the school gymnasium, they were exhausted but grateful to find a community rallying together. The gymnasium had become the de facto town center. Principal Whitmore and his staff had organized a registration system to track who was accounted for and who remained missing. Volunteers sorted donated supplies into categories: food, water, clothing, medical needs. A group of women from the local church had set up a childcare area so parents could participate in search and recovery efforts without worrying about their children. Theodore immediately volunteered for the search teams. He knew the land better than most, having farmed it for over 2 decades. Despite his own losses, he could not sit idle while neighbors might still be trapped or lost. Margaret understood without needing to hear his explanation. She kissed his dust-covered cheek and told him to be careful. The morning brought both relief and heartbreak. More survivors emerged from shelters and hiding places, their appearance each time triggering cheers from the assembled crowd. But bodies were also found, victims who had been caught in the open or whose shelters had failed to protect them. The count climbed steadily throughout the day. 18, 23, 27. Dr. Warren had not slept at all, running on adrenaline and coffee that tasted more of dust than beans. The clinic had stabilized during the night, with serious cases evacuated by helicopter once conditions allowed. Now she focused on treating the walking wounded, the countless minor injuries that could become major problems if neglected. She treated William Patterson, the meteorologist, who blamed himself for not recognizing the storm's approach. His injuries were minor, a sprained wrist and some abrasions, but his psychological wounds ran deeper. Elizabeth was not qualified to address those, but she spent a few extra minutes listening to his self-recrimination. Sometimes people needed to express their guilt before they could begin healing. The first National Guard trucks arrived around 10 in the morning, having traveled through the night from Phoenix. They brought water, food, medical supplies, and most importantly, personnel. Soldiers fanned out across the town, assisting with searches, clearing roads, distributing supplies to those who could not reach the gymnasium. The commanding officer, a major named Robert Anderson, met with Sheriff Reyes to coordinate efforts. Daniel was grateful to share the burden of leadership. He had not slept either, and the exhaustion was beginning to affect his judgment. The major was experienced in disaster response and quickly took charge of the logistics, freeing Daniel to focus on what he did best, knowing his community. By noon, the search had expanded beyond the town limits. Farm families scattered across the surrounding desert had been isolated by the storm, their fates unknown. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky, their rotors kicking up residual dust as they scanned for signs of life. The Ramirez family was found at 1:30 in the afternoon, alive but severely dehydrated. They had taken shelter in their barn when the storm hit, only to have the structure collapse on top of them. The father, Carlos, had dug them out with his bare hands, his fingers bleeding and raw. His wife and 3 children were weak but conscious, a miracle given the circumstances. Less fortunate were the Hendersons, an older couple who had retired to Arizona for the climate. Their mobile home had offered no protection against the storm's fury. Rescuers found the wreckage a quarter-mile from where it had stood, scattered across the desert like confetti. The couple had been together for 47 years. They remained together now, their bodies found still holding hands. The stories accumulated throughout the day, each one unique, but all connected by the common thread of the storm. A young mother who shielded her infant with her own body, surviving only to discover the baby had stopped breathing. A teenage boy who rescued his grandmother from a flooding basement, carrying her on his back for half a mile. A dog that led rescuers to a collapsed structure where its owner lay trapped but alive. By evening of the second day, the casualty count had risen to 34 confirmed deceased, with 11 still missing. The number would eventually reach 41, making it one of the deadliest dust storms in Arizona history, but numbers could not capture the full impact. Each death represented a family shattered, a future erased, a hole in the fabric of the community that would never fully heal. The sunset that evening was spectacular. The dust particles still suspended in the atmosphere refracted the light into bands of orange, pink and purple that stretched from horizon to horizon. Survivors gathered to watch, some in silence, others quietly weeping. It seemed both beautiful and cruel, nature displaying its magnificence just hours after demonstrating its destructive power. Margaret Saunders watched from the steps of the gymnasium, her son sitting on either side of her. Theodore had not yet returned from the search teams, but she had heard he was safe, simply too far out to make it back before dark. She would see him in the morning. For now, she had her boys, and they had her, and that was enough. She thought about the farm, about the cotton that would never grow, about the home that would need to be rebuilt from nothing. The task seemed impossible, but then, surviving the storm had seemed impossible too, and they had done that. Perhaps impossibility was simply another word for something not yet achieved. Chapter 5. Rebuilding from dust. The weeks following the storm tested the community in ways the disaster itself had not. The immediate crisis had united everyone in a common purpose: survival. But as the initial shock faded, the harder work began. Rebuilding required resources that many families simply did not have. Insurance companies disputed claims. Government assistance moved slowly through bureaucratic channels. Some residents, faced with the prospect of starting over from nothing, simply left. The Saunders family stayed. Theodore made the decision on the 3rd day after the storm, standing in the ruins of his kitchen with the sun rising behind him. This was his land. His father had farmed it before him. His grandfather had claimed it when Arizona was still a territory. He would not be the generation that abandoned it. The decision was easier to make than to execute. The cotton crop was a total loss. The irrigation system needed to be rebuilt entirely. The farmhouse required not just repairs, but reconstruction. Theodore had some savings, but nowhere near enough. He applied for emergency loans, haggling with bank officials who seemed more interested in paperwork than people. Margaret found work in town, helping at the temporary relief center that had been established in the Methodist Church. The pay was minimal, but it contributed something, and more importantly, it gave her a sense of purpose during those difficult weeks. She processed applications, distributed supplies, and listened to the stories of neighbors whose losses often exceeded her own. Thomas and Robert returned to school as soon as it reopened, though school had taken on a different meaning. The elementary building had survived, but many teachers had left, and some students would never return. Classes were combined, curricula improvised, normalcy attempted, but never quite achieved. Principal Whitmore did his best, but even his considerable optimism was tested by the circumstances. The town received an unexpected gift in late April. A businessman from Phoenix named Edward Chen had followed the storm's coverage in the newspapers and felt compelled to help. He arrived in Gila Bend with a convoy of supplies purchased with his own money and a proposal that would change the community's future. Edward was a civil engineer by training, having made his fortune designing water management systems for the growing Phoenix metropolitan area. He saw in Gila Bend not just a disaster zone, but an opportunity to demonstrate new approaches to desert construction. He offered to fund and oversee the rebuilding of the town's infrastructure, asking nothing in return except the chance to implement his ideas. Some residents were suspicious of this generosity. Outsiders rarely gave something for nothing, but Sheriff Reyes vouched for Edward after investigating his background, and slowly, the community accepted his help. Work crews arrived from Phoenix, bringing heavy equipment and expertise that the small town could never have afforded on its own. The rebuilding proceeded through May and into June. New water lines were laid deeper than before, protected against future storms. Power infrastructure was upgraded and partially buried. A community storm shelter was constructed near the town center, capable of protecting 300 people from the worst nature could deliver. The Saunders farmhouse rose again, different from before but still recognizable. Edward's engineers designed it with reinforced walls and a proper storm cellar connected to the main house by an interior staircase. Theodore joked that he had upgraded from ruins to a fortress. Margaret just smiled and started planning where to put the furniture. Dr. Elizabeth Warren decided to stay in Gila Bend permanently. She had come for retirement, but found a calling instead. The clinic needed a full-time physician, and she needed a purpose beyond gardening and reading novels. The paperwork took months to process, but by September she was officially the town's medical director. The meteorologist, William Patterson, also remained connected to the community, though in a different way. He returned to Phoenix but devoted his career to improving dust storm prediction systems. He testified before state legislators, advocated for early warning networks, and published papers that would influence weather forecasting for decades. The 1958 storm became his life's work, a tragedy transformed into scientific progress. The town held a memorial service on the first anniversary of the storm. A monument was erected in the town square, a simple granite column inscribed with the names of the 41 who had perished. Survivors gathered around it as the mayor read each name aloud, followed by a moment of silence that stretched across the desert, like the storms that had tested them. Margaret Saunders placed flowers at the base of the monument. She recognized most of the names, neighbors, and acquaintances, whose faces she could still picture clearly. The elderly Mrs. Henderson, who had always complimented her garden. Young Peter Martinez, who had delivered newspapers to their farm. The Rodriguez baby, who had stopped breathing in the storm and never started again. Theodore stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. The past year had aged him visibly, new lines carved into his face by worry and labor. But there was something else there, too, a quiet pride in what they had accomplished. The farm was producing again, a modest crop, but a crop nonetheless. His sons were thriving, hardened by their experience into young men who understood what truly mattered. The community had not just survived, it had transformed. The storm had stripped away pretenses and revealed what lay beneath: resilience, compassion, and an unbreakable commitment to each other. Newcomers like Edward Chen had become permanent residents, their lives intertwined with a place they had discovered through tragedy. Old-timers who might have left found reasons to stay, their roots deepened by the very forces that had tried to tear them out. Rosa's place reopened in a new building, larger and sturdier than before. Rosa had considered retiring after the storm, her 73-year-old body tired from decades of work. But her customers insisted she continue, and she found she could not imagine life without the diner. The breakfast crowd returned, farmers and workers and travelers passing through, all of them a little more grateful for simple pleasures like coffee and conversation. Chapter 6. The Legacy. Written in dust. The 1958 Arizona dust storm changed more than a single town. Its impact rippled outward through time, influencing policy, science, and the way a nation understood its relationship with the natural world. In the immediate aftermath, state and federal agencies launched investigations into why the storm had been so devastating and why warnings had been inadequate. The findings led to significant improvements in weather forecasting infrastructure throughout the southwest. New monitoring stations were established across the desert, capable of detecting dust storms in their earliest stages. Emergency broadcast systems were upgraded to reach isolated rural communities. The lessons paid for in lives became tools for saving future generations. The agricultural practices that had contributed to the storm's severity also came under scrutiny. The overcultivation of marginal lands, the removal of natural windbreaks, the irrigation techniques that depleted topsoil, all were examined and reformed. Federal programs incentivized conservation farming, paying landowners to maintain vegetation buffers and implement erosion control measures. The Dust Bowl lessons of the 1930s, which had faded from memory, were relearned and reinforced. For the Saunders family, the years following the storm brought gradual prosperity. Theodore diversified his crops, reducing his dependence on cotton and introducing vegetables that could be sold at farmers' markets in Phoenix. The additional income allowed him to modernize the farm, investing in equipment that made operations more efficient and less vulnerable to weather extremes. Thomas, the older son, went to college on a scholarship and studied agricultural engineering. He returned to Arizona after graduation, bringing new ideas and technologies to the family operation. Robert chose a different path, joining the army and eventually settling in Texas, but he visited every year and always helped with the harvest when he could. Margaret became a community leader in her later years, serving on the town council and chairing committees related to emergency preparedness. She never forgot the feeling of helplessness during the storm, and she channeled that memory into ensuring that future generations would be better protected. The storm shelter that Edward Chen had funded was named in her honor after her passing in 1987. Sheriff Daniel Reyes served the town for another 15 years before retiring. He often said that the storm had been the defining moment of his career, the event that taught him what law enforcement truly meant. It was not about citations and arrests. It was about being there when people needed you, standing between chaos and community, holding things together when everything seemed to be falling apart. Dr. Elizabeth Warren practiced medicine in Gila Bend until she was 80 years old, finally retiring only when her eyesight made it unsafe to continue. She had delivered a generation of babies, treated countless injuries and illnesses, and comforted families through losses both sudden and expected. When she died in 1982, the entire town attended her funeral, a testament to the impact one person can have when they choose to serve. The town itself evolved, but never forgot. Each generation learned the story of the storm, told first by survivors and later by their children and grandchildren. The monument in the town square became a gathering place for anniversaries and commemorations, a tangible reminder of what had been lost and what had been built from the loss. The desert also remembered, in its own way, the dunes that had formed during the storm, gradually reshaped over the decades, worked by wind and weather into new configurations, but traces remained, patterns in the sand that geologists could read like text, telling the story of that April day when the sky turned brown and the world changed. In the end, the 1958 Arizona dust storm was not just a disaster, it was a transformation. It revealed the fragility of human endeavors and the resilience of human spirit. It showed that nature could destroy in hours what had taken generations to build. But it also showed that communities could rebuild in ways that made them stronger than before. The dust settled. The sky cleared. The morning came, just as young Miguel Santos had known it would. And life continued, changed, but unbroken, carrying forward the memories and lessons of those who had endured. Theodore Saunders lived to see his grandchildren play in the fields he had rebuilt. He told them stories of the storm, not to frighten them but to teach them. He wanted them to understand that hardship was part of life, that no success was permanent and no failure was final. What mattered was how you responded. What mattered was whether you got back up. On his final morning in the spring of 1994, Theodore walked to the edge of his property and looked toward the eastern horizon. The sky was clear, a brilliant blue, unmarked by even a wisp of dust. Cotton stretched before him in neat rows, white bowls ready for harvest. His land, his legacy, his victory over a storm that had tried to take everything. He thought of Margaret, gone now for 7 years, and wished she could see what they had created together. He thought of his sons, scattered but connected, bound by memories that distance could not diminish. He thought of neighbors and friends, some still living, many passed on, all of them part of a community that had faced the worst and found the best in each other. The dust remembers. That phrase had come to him years ago, a way of describing how the desert held on to its history, preserving traces of everything that happened upon it. But people remember too. They carry the past with them, pass it forward to those who come after, keep alive the stories that might otherwise be lost. This is one of those stories. A story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. A story of loss and rebuilding, of fear and courage, of isolation and community. A story that happened once in a particular place and time, but speaks to something universal in the human experience. When the desert swallowed Arizona, it expected silence. It expected surrender. Instead, it found voices raised in hymns, hands extended in help, hearts unbroken by the darkness. The storm passed. The people remained, and the legacy written in dust became a testament to everything humanity can achieve when it refuses to be defeated. If you watched this far, it is because this story touched something in you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your presence here means more than numbers. It means that these memories matter, that these lives are not forgotten, that history continues to speak to those who will listen. Please take a moment to like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who appreciates stories of resilience and hope. And subscribe to this channel so you never miss another journey into the moments that shaped our world. The dust remembers. Now, so do you. Thank you for being part of this story. Thank you for carrying it forward. Until next time, remember that every storm passes, every night ends, and every community can find the strength to rebuild from whatever remains.